Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. And today I am joined by authors Ian C. Esslemont and Steven Erikson because we're going to discuss elements of inspiration, things that influence uh, texts and narratives, and explore some of the boundaries between the difference between inspiration and outright copy and pasting elements. So, Cam, really good to see you. How are you doing?
All right. Well, thanks for the invite, AP. Very happy to be here.
And Steve, as ever, a pleasure.
Yeah, glad to be here.
That guy.
That guy.
Here's it. Just so you know, someone had watched an earlier conversation I had with Steve, and they were like, Erickson really doesn't look pleased to be here. Like, yeah, because I force him to record these things and he hates it.
No, I don't hate it.
But part of the reason I wanted to bring this up with you gents, obviously, there are elements of the Malazan world and the Malazan stories that you have created that came out of what you did individually together with your friends where you were creating these things. There are elements where you drew inspiration from other sources, and you've spoken very openly and very candidly about things that you had borrowed or outright stolen from things that inspired you, things that you wanted to incorporate into your stories. And the other thing was very recently, I watched Rebel Moon. And I think there's a difference in not necessarily always in kind, but in the level to which you incorporate something from a previous story and how you incorporate it that sets it apart from just stealing and copying something. And that's kind of what I wanted to explore with you today, if you didn't mind.
Yeah, I think before you started recording, Cam sort of just threw out the phrase inspiration versus imitation. So that's probably where it kind of starts. If somebody sort of is inspired or grew up as a fan of a book or a film or whatever, and some decision is made to reboot the thing, do you basically rinse and repeat, or do you bring anything else to it? So,
Well, we've been discussing our inspiration coming from the genre, from the fantasy genre. We've been very open about that, as you said, AP, like Glen Cook and other authors. We've talked about them. And I think Steve's also brought up a lot of the films that we were watching at the time too. And some of these films contributed quite a bit to the gaming and the creation of settings and plots and stories that we just sort of picked up and went and did our own thing with. So the big example, one of them that we've talked about a lot, is how the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers contributed to gardens, like early on when we were gaming. And there is an actual source you can point to as inspiration, artistic inspiration. And so that was one of the contributing elements to the soup, if you will, the whole thing. It wasn't just the one source that we were trying to redo. It was just a contributor to a whole slew of artistic contributions.
Yeah, but, I suppose with the Three Musketeers, setting it in Darujistan for a start is a complete transplant of the story into a very different culture. And Darujistan is inspired by or influenced by something very, very different to sort of France. Like, where did the inspiration from Darujistan kind of come from?
I saw it more as a very huge, like I said, our version of Constantinople, if you will, a crossroads, a cultural crossroads, where all kinds of different regions come together the way that Constantinople was. and very cosmopolitan, with a very well-developed civic culture, where lots of other cultures come and meet.
And so how did, because I'm trying to work through in my head, because obviously the characters and some of the basic elements of that particular Darugistanian storyline of the noble being done out of his wealth, the woman who has taken over, the Lady de Winter, and the story of Athos. We can see those elements. We can see them, but very few of these specific scenes seem directly taken from the Three Musketeers. But my memory of it, might be a bit foggy.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I can't really point to one particular scene. But the gang, if you will, the grouping, was very much so a transplanting. Like you had the Senator Call, who's the Athos figure, and then you have Aramis, the sort of ladies' man in Murillo, and then you need the muscle, the sort of strong guy, and that was the assassin Rallic, who sort of stood in for the Porthos, I think. And then you have the newcomer, who's new to the group, our young recruit. So
Crocus, of course, was for this script. He was never there for the actual game. So your stand-in there would have been Krupp, I guess.
Yeah, I don't see him as a stand-in. I would see him as a variation on it. Like it's almost as if you had Dumas himself sitting at the table talking to his characters.
That's a really interesting interpretation, because I wasn't thinking of, I mean, you were creating the scenario, so I had no previous knowledge of what you were drawing as inspiration or anything else. And so then I'm building these characters. And so there was nothing about me thinking of Rallic standing in for this role or whatever, right? Or Krupp. So the creation of those characters was completely separate and distinct from anything related to Dumas. And once those characters, especially Krupp, sort of took hold, they're definitely going to modify, whatever it is you're trying to create in your scenario, because they're wild cards.
Yeah, I had no idea what characters were going to appear, of course, but I had a sort of backstory set up for the campaign, and they were going to be hanging out in this bar, and that's where they would meet, and then there would be various adventures and misadventures based on the cycle of stories from the Three Musketeers or the Four Musketeers. But I didn't know what characters Steve was going to contribute. So it was all just whatever happens, we react to that, and it goes in its own way.
And that may be what distinguishes it from complete imitation, right? So, in other words, you've got something that's inspired you, and then you introduce to it a completely disconnected element. And then you see how, you create a kind of a synthesis between these two things. So, when we discussing earlier that we were going to talk about inspiration, and I ended up sort of thinking back to those, to our days here in Victoria as students. We were not exclusively exclusively sort of positioned in a world where we were just reading fantasy fiction. So if you're just reading fantasy fiction, then all your inspiration is going to come from fantasy fiction. But we were sort of, I was taking film studies, so I was picking up a lot of obscure films and not so obscure films. But so that stuff was on the outside. And then we were writing contemporary literary fiction or whatever you want to call it. So we were getting sort of inspirations from that direction. So these things were sitting outside the genre. And I think just in our enthusiasm, we just wanted to pull in all those elements that were coming from other places, from other genres, other media, and see if it could fit in some fashion or another within a fantasy setting.
And also the direction that things went was character driven.
Yeah.
And it wasn't imposed from outside. It wasn't, okay, we've reached the second act, so now suddenly this has to happen. It was more just the characters were determining how things went. And so there was an organic naturalness to it, I think. And this is all seat of the pants. The story was just going where it was going to go. And then years later, we were looking back at that. And then we took from that elements that we wanted to use and we thought worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is interesting because obviously there's an element of structuralism where you pare away all of the surface level detail, everything that makes a character unique, and you're looking at role and function and the specific narrative movements, or you look at the structure of the narrative events. And we can do that with a lot of texts. Take Jordan's Eye of the World, and when you pare away a lot of that stuff, you go, yeah, this is recognizably the Lord of the Rings for the first book of Jordan's Wheel of Time. But obviously, once you add back on the individualism and the detail, it takes it further and further away from the source material. And it's how much is sort of copying and how much is, oh, I saw that, and the way that I would tell this type of story. And you then use it as a foundation to build from, rather than go, I'm going to retell the same story. I think there is a useful distinction between those.
Mm-hmm. There are some fantasy pieces that are actually overt retellings, right? Okay, fair enough. That's the goal, that's the project. And so once it's up front and we know what the game is, and the reader isn't being surprised or knows what to expect, then that's fine. If that's what your project is. I mean,
Steve?
Yeah. I mean, inspiration invokes or requires an engagement of the imagination, whereas imitation basically doesn't, right? So if you're creating something that you want to draw on your imagination to build, then you will always be sort of riffing off of what existed beforehand and what the things that you've focused on in terms of what inspires you. And quite often, I'm thinking back on it, we watched a lot of sort of classic films because partly because of the film studies that I was doing. And so we were watching films where the scripts had been written by William Faulkner, or adaptation of a Hemingway story by Faulkner, and or film versions of a Faulkner novel, like Long Hot Summer. And it wasn't necessarily the setting or the storylines or anything like that, which we just wanted to sort of pick up and like lift and copy and cut and paste. It was more snippets of dialogue, the points of view of characters, and a lot of sort of the very subtle communication stuff that was going on that we just found inspiring in and of itself. And so then it's not a case of cutting and pasting. It's a case of basically trying to make use of those those interesting elements, regardless of the story genre, and to sew that into the fantasy setting and into the stories that we were creating. And I think that was happening even in our gaming, not just in the writing of the books later.
Yeah, these are human stories and eternal human predicaments, and we were just dealing with them, you know. And as another film to go with what you're talking about was that you talked about, Steve, is of course The Lion in Winter, and the amazing
Dialogue.
of conflicts that are set up there, you know, daughter, son, husband, wife, and it's just everyone's fighting to get something from the other person, and that intensity comes from drama, comes from Shakespeare. It's, you can, as long as you've got that in mind that you're trying to portray, I think then the surrounding pageantry mechanisms can reflect or be drawn from just about anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there is an element that sometimes it's very easy to spot structural elements or narrative events or characters that we recognize from other stories, because they're quite often very surface level elements, and you go, it's easy to see them. And then when you start thinking about the arrangement of them and how it is told and how it is flowing, you know, there's a sort of almost like a second order level, and then there's the style in which things are done, or certain techniques, or the sudden use of a shift of perspective at a key moment. You go, oh, I recognize that from something else, but it fits naturally with what is being explored. And so that I think there are different orders of not necessarily copy, but inspiration and inventiveness and incorporation. There are different ways that it occurs. You've both spoken about the importance of Glen Cook and the Black Company, and yet many people, I think, in reading either of your series, the Book of the Fallen or the novels of the Malazan Empire, would be hard pressed to go, oh yes, this is the Black Company. I recognize, you know, I can recognize, and yet the dialogue and attitude of the soldiers, that is an element where you can see the influence of Cook maybe on how you can initially conceived of it, but there isn't a one-to-one. You can't.
No, especially since what I was seeing, and I mean, Cam, you were the one who sort of first discovered Cook, and you had Dread Empire stuff, and then you were starting to get the Black Company stuff, and I was actually at the time reading Vietnam War literature, and so when I finally picked up the Black Company, it was like, oh, I recognize this because it's the same thing. And so that aspect of it sort of, it showed me that what Glen Cook was doing was drawing upon a completely distinct genre and his own life experiences that were sort of reflected in Tim O'Brien and Gustav Hasford and all these people. And he was transposing it into a fantasy setting. And that's what was so exciting, because that was, you know, that was a kind of a demonstration of how you can take inspiration from other genres, other milieus, and just, yeah, just transpose it and see how it changes things.
And it worked for me because this was just another war story when you think
Yeah.
about it. It's just humans in war, and the period doesn't matter. The people are the same, and so they're to depict humans in a war setting that you just simply have to keep in mind that they're not going to act in a strange, different way. They're going to act recognizable in the same way.
Yeah. And hence your creation of the Crimson Guard, I guess, was sort of your take on that.
The mercenary aspect of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, because I remember talking about the short timers with you, Steve, because you went, AP, you have to read this. And yeah, you were right. It was an excellent book. Whereas that, you know, I'd been familiar with the film adaptation. But, you know, having read that and The Black Company, I can see that and go, why did no one think of, well, yeah, just do your Vietnam War or your Korean War novel and set it in a secondary world. because it that's one of the strengths of obviously fantasy literature. We can take stories that can be very difficult to read because of our gut reactions or emotional reactions to specific political or geopolitical situations, place them in a secondary world, and suddenly we've removed that knee-jerk reaction. But there's no reason why fantasy has to be done according to the rules of fantasy as established by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien in the 1940s. That, and yet it seems so obvious, and yet so few people were taking advantage of that. So that was eye-opening and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder to what extent Glenn Cook's um, Black Company is also a fusion of sword and sorcery. You know, when I think about sword and sorcery, I kind of think of it as originating in as part of an American literary tradition, more so than anywhere else. Now, maybe you can argue against that. I don't know, but that so the sword and sorcery position as kind of the anti-Tolkien position seemed to be where Glenn Cook was also drawing his fantasy inspirations from. So he had that, and of course, what sword and sorcery does is it brings everything down to a fairly human scale. That's what it's all about. And the Black Company was very much anchored in that human scale. But then, of course, that is completely reflected by one of the main themes of most Vietnam War literature is that it's down on a human scale, and the larger machinations of countries and politics and all the rest become irrelevant when you're stuck in a jungle in a hole, and it's, you know, people are sneaking up on you or coming out of tunnels. So that's kind of what I was sort of seeing with what Cook was doing was um, blending elements of sword and sorcery with his own life experience and that sort of marine-based irreverence. You know, I guess that was very much part of
Foot soldier,
yeah, it was yeah.
dark humor.
Yeah.
For me, for my money, in terms of inspiration, sword and sorcery is closer to deeper roots, like in Greek classical myth and stories, where you have humans caught between, you know, at the mercy of larger forces. The gods are fickle, and you just have to watch out for them. And these are humans who are at risk. And that's what I see sword and sorcery being closer to than, say, the high fantasy, the Tolkien-esque stories.
I think it would be relatively fair to say that Tolkien was more akin to 19th century prose romances, like a very different tradition
Romance tradition.
Yeah.
that he was drawing from. Because despite Lord of the Rings' impact on fantasy, there's very little from the Lord of the Rings now, apart from the surface level elements that we see in the genre. It's a lot of those elements that we see, or the attitude to, yeah, of course you can create an entirely new secondary world and put people in it and treat it as real. But even that doesn't originate with Tolkien. It's more sort of a handy text to point to a lot of things with, rather than Tolkien invented it or Tolkien gave us permission to do it. And, you know, Tolkien's text is incredibly important, but it is a very different style and tradition than a lot of the localized and focused human adventures of, you know, like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser or even Conan, that they were much more specific and localized in the person with boots on the ground. Whereas it's the grand epic scale of the Lord of the Rings. These people from humble beginnings, but they're part of this much bigger, greater story that's going to reshape the world. The focus is very different.
Yeah, in the Three Musketeers, of course, you're dealing with, you know, royalty and kings and kingdoms and political intrigue. but actually it's a story of the relationship between friends. It's a friendship. So that's where the real focus is. The rest of it is just the movable curtains behind that, reappear, and the pageantry. So and for imitation, okay, is that imitation then? Like, no, it's a continuum of storytelling that goes back very far. Like, for example, in Shakespeare, he knew he was dealing with very heavy tragedy, very, sort of stuff. And so he has humor injected. And we have the classic example of the two humorous characters who appear to break up and change the tone, the Guildenstern and Rosencrantz, etc. So we have as well these humorous interludes that sort of relieve the tension. And so, is that imitation? No, it's an art of storytelling.
Yeah, see, you heard it here first, folks. They just copied everything. None of it is original. They just stole all of their ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, even, you look at the Hemingway tradition in American literature, and it's also, it's kind of a counterpoint to when, say, Steinbeck went to his big epic, East of Eden, and can't remember the other one now.
Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, Grapes of Wrath. Hemingway was pushing in the opposite direction. That big epic element of history, and participation in history was not relevant to him. And so what he was writing about was just each individual, his protagonist, basically trying to get by in the world. And so it's very much a leveling effect that's occurring. And then you look at Conan, and Conan's kind of, I don't even know if you can compare them, but I think you maybe could.
Yeah, he's just trying to get by.
He's just trying to get by, but he's also at war with the epic, isn't he? I mean, he is. And so there's that whole element of the lone gunslinger is certainly present in that, or that kind of backdrop of this of something immense, historically occurring. But the interests of the main character don't point in that direction at all. They point at, putting food on the table the next day. And I think American literature really pushed in that direction, because it kind of formalized as the essence of short story writing. And that was a period in which, at least in America, short stories were almost a dominant literary influencer, as opposed to, bestsellers, and big fact books and all the rest, because that was going on at the same time.
And in terms of cinema, like the dominance of the Western in the cinema, that was so, like, let me say, hashtag not all Westerns, but the focus on the lone gunslinger riding into town, that focus on the individual, reshaping society or civilization, but at a local level. Like, it's not the whole of the West that was being fixed, but it was always, here's this corrupt town, the corrupt sheriff or the corrupt mayor or someone who is corrupt, and the gunslinger
Society is corrupt.
Yeah. What's the name? Lonesome Dove. Were you watching Lonesome Dove at that time?
Yeah, we were.
That was, yeah, because that was just jaw-dropping. It's something that the original sort of long, I don't know, was it 12 episodes, something like that?
Yeah, like once a week or something.
Yeah, but it was really long. And it took them, you couldn't do it these days. The first episode and a half, the two characters did nothing for that entire time. They talked about, going
They sat
to
on the
Mexico.
porch.
Yeah, going to Mexico and stealing some cattle, but they didn't do anything. And it was just, we're getting their backstory, and it just felt so leisurely. It felt so immersed in that world, that I was absolutely blown away by that. But Yeah, you couldn't do that these days, I guess.
The Western was big as far as an inspiration, but also the detective
Yeah.
hard-boiled genre, the hard-boiled tough guy. I can see a lot of that in Sword and Sorcery, and then thus in our own work.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's sort I think with Sword and Sorcery, it's almost like a lot of the time Sword and Sorcery was almost like the fantasy version of the Western, because quite often Sword and Sorcery focused on the individual or the very small group who were moving from place to place. Sword and Sorcery was less focused on here is the location and everyone is here and things come towards you. That Sword and Sorcery didn't really focus on invasion narratives or intrusion narratives. It was more the wanderer and the continuing adventures of as they went from place to place,
Nor,
which
yeah, nor is it interested in political history.
Yeah.
And it's not interested in righting wrongs in the sense of re-establishing an older authority order, like the Return of the King, right? The story is they to bring the past back and reinstall it the way it once was, and bring things back to order. That's not the concern.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even that sort of motif of the participation of your main characters in a story that actually puts the world at threat in some fashion. In other words, the end of the world kind of thing was never part of Sword and Sorcery. It was taken as a given that the world simply, it existed as a continuity in terms of backdrop.
But it was full of dangers, though.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Personal dangers, yeah, but
like
not end of the
well,
world.
monsters and horror, and our eldritch terrors, and that had to be put down.
Yeah,
So,
but even those, I would argue they generally, it was not world ending, universe ending, that you had
well,
in Epic kind of
yeah,
thing.
and not world ending, but also now Conan didn't set out to defeat the monster in the whatever. It's just that it got in his way.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
exactly.
like I'm trying to rob this place. What is this giant snake doing here?
Yeah, and I remember
And
writing.
so he kills the snake, which is the avatar of some ancient god or
Yeah,
whatever. But it got in his way.
yeah, yeah, and I remember actually playing off of that motif with Karsa. Uh, I have a whole scene where he runs into a Kachane Naruk, and they have a big fight, and it's completely not relevant to anything. Um, and that was me having fun with yeah, Conan stumbling into things all the time and just getting it out of his way. Good fun.
and like oddly enough, like that idea of the itinerant warrior, the wanderer, we saw with Blue Eye Samurai that it translates very much into that sort of the Eastern because it fits with that. But you could even transpose it to the sort of the hedge knight wandering around medieval Europe looking for basically hiring on to what lord can afford to pay me, and I'm going to go and fight these battles because I'm essentially a mercenary. I have an expensive horse and armor, this all, and they stumble into things, and you can see that framework.
Yeah, I mean, all of Howard's other stories, right? His Solomon Kane stories and all that kind of stuff. That's exactly what it is. It's the Wanderer. And of course, people have often theorized that if Howard had not killed himself, he was heading into writing westerns as opposed to fantasy. That's
He had written a number already. Yeah.
yeah, he had. But most of them were comedic, weren't they? They're actually
Well,
tall tales.
yeah, but you can broaden out Western to say stories of the oil fields and
Mm,
prize fighters, and
mm,
and all of that sort of comes together in the West. And
yeah.
we have this one single avatar sort of character emerging that epitomizes all of these characteristics, and so they come together into one individual.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how we can look at certain elements in the story and go, oh, I can see parallels between X element and this thing. And
Mhm.
so with Gardens of the Moon, parallels between the Darujhistan crew and the Three Musketeers. But you don't look at the Darujhistan crew and go, it is the Three Musketeers. And I think, that to me is one of the distinctions that is sometimes helpful to draw. You can see parallels, but it's not the same. Whereas when you look at something like Rebel Moon by Zack Snyder, they aren't so much parallels as you're looking at the same line that's been colored in with a different marker. And that's where I think there is a distinction. It's not just drawing inspiration. It's, no, here is the thing. I'm just going to color it in differently. And that I think is different to drawing inspiration or even paying homage to something.
Yeah.
Where is that line? Where's that line? Where do you can push it so far, but then you fall off the cliff, so to speak. And I wonder about that line. That's an interesting distinction.
Because I don't think it's clear. I don't think there is like a really easy. It's 97%. Here it is. It's at 97% that you do. That I think there are always elements that, as you examine them, you go, this is getting closer and closer and closer. Okay, no, it's gone too far. And it's going to come down to individual readers or individual viewers about crossing that line. Certainly, like one of the criticisms of early Brooks and early Jordan, it was too similar to The Lord of the Rings. And it felt more like imitation rather than inspiration. But for a lot of other readers who weren't as familiar with The Lord of the Rings, because they weren't aware of that, it felt new. And then when they go to The Lord of the Rings, they go, oh yeah, but it's different enough because Moraine isn't Gandalf. The character, different sex, character, different characteristics. Lan isn't Aragorn. And how many of these things do we characterize as superficial changes and how many are significant changes? Well, and Cam, like you ripped off Elric and Murkoch's Elric and Stormbringer, which poor Steve for years. I never did that. Why do people keep saying this? I've never. And Cam.
Speaking of imitation, no. When you're gaming, you just crib from everywhere. You just take whatever you like. Oh, that's bright and shiny. I like that. I'll use that in my game. This wasn't meant for public consumption.
Yeah, but again,
so we ended up with this weapon, and it's not exactly the same.
No.
It's different.
Yeah, and I think the advantage was because I didn't know anything about it, that when I ran with it in the fiction, especially, it's not connected in any way. It is its own thing because I'm not pulling from any other kind of inspiration. So when I'm describing stuff, in a sense, it's not just secondhand because it's based on details you gave me during the gaming, but it's actually third hand, right? Because you were drawing that from Moorcock that I wasn't aware of. So those more unique elements of that are in Dragnapur, yeah, they were kind of created in ignorance of the source material. So that probably was a good thing in the long run.
And I think, and again, it's an element of we can point to superficial similarities and go, oh, it's that thing. Or we can look at the deeper aspects of it. And it's where we draw that line. That's where it gets, it's not neat. It's not easily divisible. But I think for almost everyone, we get to that point where we look at it and go, no, this is too derivative of, this is too similar to. And like the elements of the Three Musketeers in Gardens of the Moon, and I presume from the Gardens of the Moon film script that you had done, like those elements of, say, Lady de Winter, Lady de Winter, and the elements of that aspect of it. But there's so much else going on that they weren't the major focus. It wasn't, here's the Three Musketeers. We're now putting it in a fantasy city, but yeah, it's the Three Musketeers. It was taking certain elements and then letting them loose in a secondary world, letting them loose, and then minor parts of the story and then seeing where it would go. And so I think there's still identifiable elements of it, but it's clearly not just stealing from Duma. Like,
No, and Crop blew all that out of the water. So sometimes, yeah, just the characters you throw in, and then we ended up fusing in, the whole Malazan bridge burners. Yeah.
So the old saw, okay, imitation versus inspiration. The old saw about writing is that there's only 6 plots apparently in the world. And there's only 6 stories you can tell. So if I say I'm going to write a novel about 2 families, and the son of one of the family kidnaps the daughter of the other family, and then that family gathers a whole army and they go and they besiege that family in its castle, and I'm going to write that story, and someone will say, well, wait, that's Helen of Troy, right? But this has been done before. Well, it's the same story, but it's all in the execution. Like, you could tell that story in a completely new and fascinating and way that doesn't just take elements from the Iliad and just has them set piece by set piece. You don't have to do that.
and we have, Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai, and then the Western remake, The Magnificent Seven. That, yeah, the parallels are striking, but there's still a difference in tone, and there's still a difference in almost like the message and what is being said, and we can see the very clear parallels between them. Like, I am not trying to fudge the issue here in any way, but of course, Kurosawa's Seven Samurai was heavily influenced by Ford's westerns in the first place, and so even in the formulation of the Seven Samurai, there are going to be elements that would bleed back into the Western because it's coming from those elements. And so
and then Kurosawa did Shakespeare all over the place, right? So I remember, I think Ran was one of the films we watched at that time, Cam, and that just that also floored us. That was exquisite.
Lear,
yeah,
yes, Lear, and he also did Shakespeare. He did Macbeth.
Throne of Blood.
Kurosawa did a Macbeth as well.
Yeah, Throne of Blood, I think it was called.
Throne of Blood.
Throne of Blood. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was what its title. I couldn't remember the title.
Yeah.
Wow, that was really amazing.
And so is that cultural appropriation, or is that, stepping completely in the wrong direction here? I mean, literary inspiration, I think it does cross all those cultural boundaries. And it's just a part of the process of producing art these days. And maybe has always been that way. But that's a whole different topic.
But I also think it's interesting because in our processing of narrative, because a narratee is usually very active in understanding the narrative in front of them. If you came from a completely different background and culture to anything from the Western canon, you completely remove from, and then you watch a Shakespearean play, your understanding of it, you start seeing it in terms of how you understand narrative, how you understand culture, how you understand the world. So you can understand Kurosawa looking, say, at Macbeth and seeing a version of Macbeth that other people don't see, hence the creation of Throne of Blood. But that there's so much changed with it. Like, you can still recognize elements, but there's so much to it that is unique. And I think that's what makes this such a fascinating, muddy gray area, that we like to be able to draw a line and go, this has gone too far. But that line is actually very hard to specify, except on a case-by-case individual basis. Because as soon as you make a general rule about it, someone's going to come around and point to Kurosawa and go, what about what Kurosawa did? And you go, oh yeah, but that's different. Why is it different? Because it was really good. And if it comes down to, if it's executed well, it's fine. If it's done poorly, then no, it's, well, yeah, if it's done badly, it's going to be bad. But that's not a useful definition about where this line is. how well you executed it.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I find fascinating, the commonalities between a lot of different narratives. And yet when we talk about literature, we tend to hone in on what authors inspired you. When we talk about literature, we focus on what literary works inspired the authors we're discussing. And we forget film, television, radio plays, all these other stories. And it's not just books, because we're surrounded by narrative. And I think the incorporation of all of these things is inevitable. Like, we are shaped by it. We live in this cauldron of narrative, and we're surrounded by it. We are immersed in it. We are invariably going to have something that sparks in our mind. Oh, that's a really cool idea. And it's because in the back of our head, it was something we saw 30 years ago that we've misremembered and connected to something else. And it leads to an original, at least to us, idea. But someone else might be able to look and go, oh, but I saw it in that thing, or I read it in that thing.
Yeah, I mean, narratives built into all the social sciences as well, right? So history, classics, sociology, anthropology, psychology, there's built-in narrative there. So in a sense, you're not just drawing from, film and television and all that kind of stuff. You can draw from the history books you're reading, because it's all there as well.
So imitation. I mean, if you actually admit right from the start, then I think it's fine, as I was saying, because you're not cheating, so to speak, the audience. The audience, like if you write a book that's a complete cover to cover of an earlier book, and you put your name on it, you pretend it's yours, there's an element of dishonesty there. So you're not being upfront with your audience. And I think maybe that's where, if you're trying to hide or you don't admit, or there's that element of not being upfront with the audience that I think maybe is a problem.
It's interesting because I think film and television, the visual medium, is a lot more ambivalent with this respect, right? So, we've had stuff coming up in the last few years where some very, very popular authors have been caught out for plagiarizing whole sections and whole, paragraphs and all the rest. And yet in film and television, you can see camera angles and particular scenes that are completely plagiarized from a preceding film or whatever. And that's perfectly fine. You just sort of you're ripping off absolutely every element about it, and apparently that's okay. But in terms of the written word, it's a whole different story, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. If someone has a scene in which people are opening the boot, the trunk of a car, and it's shot from inside as the boot opens, we go, oh yeah, Tarantino did that. That's the shot that Tarantino established. But now, if someone else uses it, you go, oh, they got it from Tarantino. Like, we recognize it, but we don't think that they're plagiarizing because of the shot technique.
Interesting, isn't it?
Which is weird, because we think of it, well, how else would you do it? And the thing was, at least we attribute it to Quentin Tarantino. But I remember when there was the episode of The Orville and the episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, where that's remarkably like Alien. Remarkably. Like, you do realize people are aware of the film Alien. Can you at least in the credits acknowledge it? And then later on in Strange New Worlds, you're aware of Le Guin and the ones that walk away from Omelas.
And they didn't acknowledge it, right? But you see, that not acknowledging it is the filmic tradition, not the literary tradition, right?
Well, you don't have to acknowledge common camera angles, but maybe plot and story ought to be acknowledged.
I don't know. I mean, part of the narrative of film is camera positioning
Mhm.
and character positioning within a scene. So, to what extent are you going to, be ripping certain things off, and repeating them, and then sticking your own name on it? Speaking of, Rebel Moon and the cantina scene and all the rest, right? I mean, um,
Funny, I was just gonna say, I was just gonna say that now in science fiction movies, no one can ever do a cantina scene ever
no,
again.
never again. Yeah.
It's forbidden.
But you see, and that's the thing that's really weird because in so many westerns and in space westerns, there's the scene in the bar where the person comes in, we get it, and a bar fight starts, we get it. But it's seeing that sequence in Rebel Moon, I'm like, at least disguise the thing that you are doing. Like in almost all the other ones that I have ever seen, there's an attempt to make it unique to that story. Whereas this went, right, so we're doing this thing, and now, oh, the next, what happened next in the story? Hang on, let me go and check this film. Uh, the next thing that happens in the story is this thing, and it's the same sequence,
Mm,
and that's what makes the scene so bad. And even the psychology of that scene doesn't work. Oh,
no.
we're trying to find this rebel. Can it in public after seeing an informant dragged away?
No, no, no. That's classic D&D, isn't it?
Hello,
Basically,
barkeep. What
yeah,
rumors are there?
yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know whether it's because it was really badly done that's why this scene is so offensive. But it's easy to look at it, and I think because it was so paper thin in terms of incorporating these elements, that's why it was so offensive as a
Well, no,
viewpoint.
I would say it's because thematically it's internally inconsistent. That's what makes it horrendous, right?
No, that's what makes the entire film bad.
Yeah,
But in
the
picking out the
entire film.
cantina scene in particular, that
It's okay. It's okay because before they went into the cantina, one of them didn't say a worse collection of scum and villainy can never be found.
That's okay then. Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
okay.
yeah.
But
Don't want to plagiarize.
Yeah.
when we see that we've seen those scenes where they walk into the saloon in a western, which is obviously the inspiration that George Lucas had. Like, I'm not hiding that fact. Like, that whole scene of walking in, like Luke walking in with the door, he's walking into a saloon, but then Obi-Wan Kenobi goes off into the corner to quietly talk to try and find a smuggler who'll take them. They just walk in and brazenly go, "We need to." You're like, why are you giving your plan away to everyone here?
We're here to fight the Empire.
Yeah, but then you've got, Lord of the Rings and walking into the bar there, which then becomes the D&D versions of that kind of stuff, the
Yeah,
pastiche
agreed.
of it.
Oh, but that's
Yeah.
different. That's a tavern. And a tavern is
Oh, it's
very,
a
very
tavern.
different, Steve. You know that.
Oh, oh, oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
But
nothing like that at all. I was just watching the latest season of Reacher, and again, walk into the bars and big fight breaks out. I think, yeah, it's kind of a thing, right?
but and again, I think it's looking at the structural element. A bar where people are drinking and socializing, and there's people from all over the place, is a potential area of drama. And competing interests, or someone to get betrayed, or a fight to break out because they're drinking. There are all
Bullies.
those elements that makes it a useful location. But you don't just copy the scene almost beat for beat from somewhere else.
And the
But
point that Steve was making that I sort of trampled on a little bit was that it's not logical. It's not internally consistent. Like it doesn't belong, right? And so, and you get that again and again. And so that's the real problem, I think.
yeah, I think the idea of also we can make one added distinction, which is paying homage to something. So I immediately think of Silverado, which, you know, basically revisited all those classic motifs of the Western. but in such a loving way that you were on board with that from start to finish. And then it started to humanize those scenes. Like it would take the cliched tavern, and suddenly the owner of the tavern suddenly becomes a very interesting person. Um, so it builds on stuff. It gives more depth to those scenes. But I mean, the entire film was a wonderful homage to your classic westerns.
And you know, homage is interesting because clearly you have to evoke the thing, and the
Mhm.
thing has to be discernible
Yeah,
because it's an
identifiable.
homage. You want to, but it is done in a very respectful or honorable way that you're trying to go. This thing really inspired me. This thing is wonderful. Let's look at it.
Upfront. Yeah, it's upfront and it's overt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you know, we could say that about Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, that it's upfront and overt, that it's just ripping off all these stories.
But it's not front and
Except
overt.
for the absence of internal consistency, because basically the simplicity of the Star Trek um, dichotomy, the or not Star Wars rather, the good versus evil, the light versus dark, and all the rest, um, completely muddies up. But not in Rebel Moon, but not for the purposes of complexity or realism. Even it becomes more a case of, well, hang on, I'm listening to this opening statement in this film, and none of that makes any sense because you're basically, first of all, you're calling the assassin treacherous, but the assassin who kills the king and queen, that king and queen's empire was rapacious and expansive and totalitarian and horrible. So where's the treachery coming in? And then apparently everything is all about returning to the original royal line, because the princess is cute and therefore is good. And so a return to that totalitarian state, as opposed to the regent's version of that totalitarian state using the same armies. None of this makes any sense.
Um, but you know, when we talk, because you can talk about homage and we can talk about parody again, like both in homage and parody, the subject matter has to be overt. It has to be easily recognizable. But it's done for two very different purposes. In homage, to pay respect to honor. In parody, to make fun of and to send up. Because wasn't it the film Airplane was almost a shot by shot remake of an airplane disaster movie? Like
Yeah.
you could match them,
Yeah.
but it was a deliberate parody of that.
Mhm.
They were upfront and honest. You know, that big popular disaster movie that we all saw? Here it is
Yeah.
again, but we're making fun
I
of
think
it.
that the title of that one was Airport, actually.
Yeah, that was the one. Yeah,
Oh.
with Charlton Heston and various other. Yeah.
And so I think parody, both parody and homage, where we have a scene that is parodied or a scene that is an homage. Again, there's that recollection of, yes, this is the original thing that we're talking about. It has to be recognizable. It has to be visible. And
Right. Okay. That suddenly gives me an idea. I wonder if, because as Cam mentioned earlier too, for parody and homage to work, you have to know the source material. The audience has to be aware of the original tropes. But we're getting a generational turnover, right? And so now when things are being redone or imitated or copied, there's no guarantee that the audience is even aware of the original version of these things. And so it then has a different function. It basically reintroduces the same story, same film, to a younger audience that is not necessarily aware of the original.
like
So
Alien Romulus.
like Alien Romulus, yeah, which is sort of a juvenile teenage version of, at least the writing was, and the voiceovers of the trailers, version of Alien. Yeah.
Yeah, but when we watched that trailer, like we all looked at it and went, isn't
What?
that isn't that just literally the film Alien, just with younger people?
Right, but Alien is what, 50 years old now, right? Whatever.
Yeah, because Alien was, I think it was it 78, 79, something like that. I don't know. I'll look it up. But and yeah, and that's the point. A lot of people today are going to, well, no, I've never seen I've heard of it, but I've never seen it because it's a really old movie and I don't watch old movies.
Well, now you can see it again.
And now
Wow.
we can see it again,
New and improved.
but they can see it for the first time in a format and style and with the special effects that they are used to. So again, I think that's an interesting point about it. About we often talk and make grand statements. Oh, Hollywood is bankrupt. But there are certain generational shifts where you go, okay, remake something that worked before, but make it for the new audience.
Yeah, that same point, Steve, can be made about genres like the Western.
Sure.
It fell away, and very few people growing up had seen a Western. And then all of a sudden we get this Western in space.
Mandalorian, yeah.
Or Star Wars for that matter. And it's a huge hit. And well, all he did was took a Western and put it in space. And so.
Yeah.
I think The Mandalorian's a great example of this because season one of The Mandalorian, which we all enjoyed, but every episode you were going, I swear I recognize this story.
The Western.
Yeah, but each one of them was almost like I would have to go back and try and find which one corresponded to which film because I'm going, this looks remarkably similar to something I have already seen. But it was in the Star Wars universe. It was a space western. But all of the narrative bones were very much from established, well-told stories. And we had the same thing with the alien inspired episodes of those two science fiction shows I mentioned, or the Le Guin inspired story that they did. But then it comes down, where is that line then between what is an inspiration and what is flat out copy?
Yeah, like I say, the rules for plagiarism are different for film and television than they are for books, for literature.
We're different in art, I think, just generally. It all comes down to the eye of the holder. I mean, it's same for visual arts and painting. How close can you come to an earlier version of a landscape and etc. And
it depends on the signature you put on it, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, just imagining my scribbles and then me put a Van Gogh in the bottom. Oh yeah, everyone's gonna believe this.
So we're getting towards forgery.
Yeah. And especially if you have an intellectual property, so the name is identifiable.
And of course, like the whole intellectual property thing is coming up in a lot of discussions because Steamboat Willie has now public domain. It's no longer copyrighted. The original Disney Mickey Mouse short, is no longer protected by copyright, and yet it's more complicated than that. The Conan Doyle estate used to sue people all the time, going, "Well, you've taken this aspect of the story or of the character of Sherlock Holmes. So even though the first couple of Sherlock Holmes stories were out of copyright, this later bit, this aspect of the character was in a later book that's still in copyright. So we're suing you. Give us the money." There are difficulties with some of this stuff, and that's do you remember the TV show House MD with Hugh Laurie? And that was clearly modeled on Sherlock Holmes. It was a Holmesian medical mystery show where the case they were trying to solve was not a murder but a mystery disease, but it was clearly Sherlock Holmes placed in a medical context. But it felt really unique. It felt new. It didn't feel like it was ripping off Sherlock Holmes, even though a lot of the techniques used and a lot of the structure for it,
a lot of the character stuff and his drug addiction and all the rest. I mean, that's Holmes.
Yeah, the asocial genius is become a trope.
Yeah.
But that didn't feel like it was ripping off Sherlock Holmes. It felt very much inspired by Sherlock Holmes. And we go, is that because we liked the episodes, or is it because it was doing enough different with them?
Yeah, both. Yes to both.
I'm so glad I discussed this stuff with you, Steve. Well, listen, we've had a fun chat about it. Cam, Steve, thank you both very much. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
For those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.